welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. So most, but not all of you are alumni of the Trust. I imagine, but I believe most of you already know what the Trust is, but just for the benefit of the recording, I'll just say that the Weidenfeld-Hoffmann Trust provides full scholarships to international students coming from emerging economies with some qualified exceptions. In Oxford, the scholars offer the leadership program with components that range from the ethical to the entrepreneurial to soft skills training and public speaking. So my name is Temitope Ajileya, and I've been a part-time member of the staff of the office for the past 2 years. I am also a Githu student in computer science at the end of my 3rd year. And before computer science, I did math. So I was one of the lines in the introduction of Just Had Water really piqued my interest. Rhett wrote, and I quote, scientists have long been searching for a unified field theory, one answer to all of the questions about the physical universe, end quote. So in writing this book, Rhett is inspired by the desire to find a unified social policy theory. So the question is there a single thing that can prevent war, diseases, and discrimination, to name a few? Rhett is Professor Larson, the Richard Morrison Professor of Water Law at Arizona State University, and the lead of a USAID-funded project to improve water security in Lebanon, where the recent explosion has made an already precarious situation even more dangerous. Rhett is also an alum, as you know, as you've heard, of the leadership program, which is why I am allowing myself to use the first name. Rhett believes the unified social policy theory is water, and in the next few minutes, he'll tell us more about the evidence in support of this theory and how it can be employed by practitioners in the field. So without further ado, I pass the mic to Claudia, who is currently a research assistant at the Stockholm Environmental Institute, an international nonprofit research and policy organization that tackles environment and development challenges. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Rhett, for your time. I've had the opportunity to read what you shared with us, and also I was looking through your book, and it was really interesting to see how you've divided the book across so many topics. And let's start off by your opening. You opened the book with a personal story, right? So better yet, not just the personal story, but your first drop of water that completely changed your perception on water and in life. So I was just wondering if you could share a bit more with us. Why was that a turning point for you and leading to Just Add Water, basically leading to the moment you're here now? And would you ever imagine this would be fitting in a pandemic time? So how that first drop of water to Just Add Water in our current times, if you could take us through that personal journey.
Sure. So a little more, first of all, can I just express my gratitude to everyone, Temi especially, for organizing all of this and how wonderful it is to see everyone. And especially if I can say to my dear friends, to Jehun and Manisha, how wonderful it is to see you again, and to Elizabeth, who I owe so much. If you do hear my children in the background, they owe a lot to Elizabeth too, who went to bat for us to find a great school while we were living here in Oxford. And her generosity continues to bless my family as they continue to read the books she gave my children. They've now been passed on to my youngest. So it is just, it's such a privilege to be able to do this with all of you. But thank you, Claudia. So my personal background, I grew up in Arizona, which for those of you who don't know much about Arizona, it's in the Colorado River Basin in the southwestern United States. I grew up in the desert. I come from a farming and a ranching family. So I grew up in a community, every blessing that my family ever said over the food prayed for rain. So I lived my whole life thinking and worrying and talking about water and irrigation. But it wasn't until I moved and lived in the Dominican Republic for 2 years that I really saw the value of water, which is strange that a kid from the desert didn't appreciate water until he went to a tropical island. When I was living in the Dominican Republic as a missionary, a Category 5 hurricane hit the island. And it was devastating, as you can imagine. There were a lot of deaths in the neighborhood that I was living in. There was a mudslide that destroyed most of the neighborhood. And most of my time after the hurricane was over was spent in rescue efforts for the next several days, and then rebuilding efforts for several months. And it was really a life-changing moment in a lot of ways for me, but especially when it came to water, because as you can imagine, in the wake of a hurricane, there were just an enormous number of challenges with housing, challenges with food, challenges with security. But everything seemed easier to deal with if I could just get my hands on a clean cup of water, and if we could get rid of all of the dirty water. And it wasn't that hard to rebuild a home. It wasn't that hard to move food from one location to another. It wasn't that hard to teach or to train. But if you could just get the dirty water out of the way, the flood water, and if we could just get everyone clean water, everything else seemed more manageable. And that, I think, was really the beginning of a passion for the idea that if I could just start with something. And I think for a lot of us, when we look at the problems in the world, that's the hardest question to answer. It's where do we begin? And my book is at least an attempt to argue that the beginning should be water. That if you're looking for some place to start making a difference, the place to start is water security for everyone in the world. If we could give that gift to everyone, the miracle of enough clean water and safety from the dangers of water, then a lot of other problems that you might think have nothing to do with water, they might maybe not be solved, but at least be surprisingly advanced. And just going to Claudia's point about a global pandemic, I remember being in the wake of that hurricane. We would have a mass outbreaks of conjunctivitis in our neighborhood, so pink eye. And there was not enough water for good hygiene. People couldn't wash their hands. The water was contaminated, so you'd watch conjunctivitis just spread through the entire community. And so there was, unsurprisingly, lots in the Dominican Republic, a lot of citrus fruit floating around in the floodwaters. So I would take lemons and oranges and cut them open and squeeze them into my eyes to try and keep my eyes clean so that I wouldn't get conjunctivitis. And it's just another example of what a difference having a little bit of water can make just to wash your hands. And I know that feeling of having to look at your water supply in your home and know you're going to make a choice between washing your hands or having enough to drink. And that's just not a choice I want anyone in the world to ever have to make.
Wow, and that's a very interesting story of feeling it in the first place, right? And I think it connects really well with the narrative you set out for the book, because from what I read, you took that to your profession as well, and by adding the water law component, which sometimes, from what I saw, people also ask you exactly what does that mean, and then realize that water is present everywhere, right? So my other question for you is, in the book, you argue really well that no other challenge is more fundamental to more global problems than water security, and then you make connections for different themes such as climate change, health, gender, and virtually every major social challenge has a significant and underappreciated water component. So why is it needed then for us to have this unified social policy theory based on water and security? Is that because of the wicked problem you mentioned, and then how not to oversimplify these issues at the same time?
Well, I will say that my two biggest concerns in writing this book were, number one, my concern of a lack of profundity, that inevitably, if you're going to write a book this broadly, I was only going to scratch the surface of each one of these topics. Whole volumes can and have been written on the connection between water and gender inequality, or water and racial inequality, or water and armed conflict, and I only tackle these in a single chapter. And I suppose my response to that criticism is, you can read an entire book about Pearl Harbor, or you can read an entire book about World War II. Either book has their place. And so I guess I'm not that bothered by the idea that maybe my book isn't as deep, it's broad, but hopefully people will read this and then read scholars who have gone into greater depth. But my bigger concern is the one that you brought up, which is oversimplification. I do worry that the book is saying, oh, well, all of the world's problems are really simple. Just get everybody a glass of water and racism will disappear, which of course is ridiculous. That's not true any more than even if we got everybody a glass of water in the hurricane, that wouldn't have rebuilt homes. It wouldn't have cured diseases. It wouldn't have solved poverty. It wouldn't have kept people safe. So I do worry that the book is an oversimplification. Indeed, water security by itself is so complicated that it implicates so many other things. It's difficult to take water security and separate it from other challenges like education. So I do worry about the oversimplification, but I guess what comforts me at the risk of my book being an oversimplification is that one feeling of maybe we just need some place to begin and we can feel overwhelmed by these wicked problems that are so multifaceted and so interdisciplinary that they can paralyze us. And I suppose what I'm really trying to do is to say, I have an idea about where we could all start if we just raised this particular priority. And I probably am trying to get a bit of a chip off of my shoulder in the book, like you said, which is, it bothers me as a legal scholar when I am around other legal scholars, when I say I am a water law scholar and someone who studies bankruptcy or corporate law or criminal law or constitutional law will say, that's a very narrow field. And I will think, how in the world can you think of water as a narrow field? I mean, how many people are getting arrested? How many people are drinking water? Water's bigger. It's just bigger. And so I suppose part of the book is me making an argument that says, not only should it be the #1 priority, but perhaps in arguing it should be the #1 priority, I will settle if the success of the book is just people making it a higher priority.
And yeah, I mean, personally, I really like when you make the parallel of the first drop of water that changed your mindset to this book also being the first drop of water for many other scholars and for many other people involved in different sectors. Sometimes they don't have the direct perception of water or the value of water as we discuss. But back to the aspect of connecting water to different areas and different study fields. One integration that you mentioned in the book is that epidemiology and water laws is still lacking proper integration, and you mentioned the ex-ante rules and then the ex-post rules in terms of taking care of the people who are infected. Also, you go back to the Bradley's classification. I think when you write that book, when I read that part, you can just not think of the classes we had in water and health, and then you go back to those 3 agendas, so the red, blue, and green. I don't know your take on that integration, but given our moment right now, how do you think this integration will move forward? Do you see it becoming more natural now because of the current situation we're dealing with, or not necessarily?
I don't know. I think that there are certainly going to be areas where we're going to appreciate the significance of water as a fundamental protective agent in pandemics. And I will give you the example from something I've been working on since the start of the pandemic. For those of you who aren't aware, in Arizona, within the borders of Arizona is the Navajo Nation, which is an indigenous sovereign nation in the United States. It is the largest Native American community, largest Native American land mass in terms of pure reservation. And their infection rates and death rates have been higher than any other population in the United States in the coronavirus outbreak. And a lot of this is because the Navajo they live in relatively small communities that are widely dispersed in a very arid region. And a lot of their groundwater is subject to uranium contamination from decades of uranium mining on their land. On top of that, they are sort of trapped in a long-standing water rights dispute along the Colorado River with other states, with other Native American tribes, with downstream riparians like the Grand Canyon. and the federal government. But they're also stuck in a long-standing water rights adjudication in a court case with their neighboring Native American tribe, the Hopi people. And a lot of my work lately has been spent trying to find a way to resolve these disputes in exchange for more water and water remediation for the Navajo and the Hopi people, because one of, and I would argue the largest reason that they have been more vulnerable than any other population in the United States to COVID-19 is simply a lack of water for adequate hygiene and sanitation. And so what we've been talking about is making effectively a trade where the Navajo and the Hopi would give up some rights to their reserved water in exchange for more financing for water infrastructure so that we can get water to these communities so that they can wash their hands and have more protection. It's not going to happen in time. We're not going to save enough lives in this pandemic, but I'm hoping that this is the beginning of a solution to saving lives in the next pandemic. And if nothing else, maybe raising the importance of finding a resolution to legal disputes with water, some more urgency to finding these disputes, because they've languished for decades. And this is a moment that people are like, look, we can fight about this in court until our children's children are arguing about it in court, or we can solve this problem now and get people the water that they need before they start dying.
So again, it goes back to the priorities you were mentioning, right? Although you have so many problems taking place, maybe water could be the starting point, not necessarily the only point, but the starting point. And in that, you also have one chapter dedicated to human rights. And you mentioned at some point that there may be some one of the parts you say human rights to water conflicting with this agenda of creating resilience to water diseases and potentially other topics that you may feel are still preventing us to achieve human rights to water. So what for water management as a whole? Because when you talk to policymakers, that may not be a priority. When you talk to businesses, that may not be a priority as well. So how do you frame it within the context of?
Hopefully I can answer your question. You were breaking up a little. I don't know if that was my computer or if other people were dealing with that. But what I understood you asking is, how can we, first of all, that the human right to water can conflict with other water aims, and how do I frame it in a way to policymakers so that they see the value of a human right to water while perhaps mitigating some of these conflicts?
Perfect. You summarized it perfectly. Yes.
All right. Well, so I am a believer in the human right to water. I think that it's, if water isn't a human right, then what could be? I mean, it seems silly that we would go to someone who's dying of cholera or dying of thirst and tell them, oh, don't worry, you have freedom of religion, or don't worry, you have the right to habeas corpus. Isaiah Berlin would say, we must put first things first. Boots before Pushkin, as Dostoevsky would say. Which is to say, there are certain things that come first. And I think water is the ideal candidate for how can we build a regime that has enforceable, protectable rights? We have to begin by making sure people have enough water to live a dignified life. The challenge with a human right to water is, A, defining exactly what it means. When you say everybody should have enough water, that just raises the question, well, how much water is enough? How clean is clean enough? When you say access, what does access mean? Does that mean free? Does it mean affordable? Is affordable relative? How far away from the point of use should your point of access be? Does that depend on your culture? Does it depend on geography and geology? Is what's sufficient in England not the same as what's sufficient in Arizona? So I think you have to do a good job when you're articulating the human right to water, what exactly you mean, because in the end, there's only two kinds of people in the world. There are people with enough water to live and dead people, meaning everybody who's alive right now found enough water to stay alive. So when we're arguing about the human right to water, what we're really arguing about is not enough water to stay alive. We're arguing about enough water to live a quality of life, a dignified life. And that's a much more difficult question. How much water does it take to live a dignified life is a hard question. And if the way that we're implementing this difficult to articulate right is a way that it interferes with sustainability, meaning everyone in every industry has free access to water as much as they could possibly want so that we're not achieving adequate cost recovery, then we're going to watch water infrastructure decay and we're going to see unsustainable water uses. So while I'm in favor of a human right to water, I believe that the way that you formulate it, articulate it, and implement it is really, really important to make sure that it doesn't sort of blow up in your face and prove to be more of an obstacle than a tool. I'm also a lawyer, which I think colors the way that I think about a human right. If I were purely a policy activist, I would deploy the rhetoric of rights much more freely, because when we say that water is a right, or education is a right, or the internet is a right, it's a way of raising the lexical priority, the relative importance, and it's a branding tool that you can use to show people how important something is. But as a lawyer, when I hear the word right, I need to be able to take that on behalf of a client and walk into a court or an agency and get something with it. And as a lawyer, if I can't take that right and walk into a governmental agency or into a court and trade it for something and say, or enforce it effectively in some way, then at least as a lawyer, I'm not sure that the right is going to do me the good that it would do. As a policy activist, it does me a lot of good, but as a lawyer. So when I would talk to policymakers, I would say you need to distinguish in your mind the role of rights rhetoric in terms of raising the importance of water policy versus rights rhetoric in the law, where I think you need to be much more instrumental and think about giving people a tool that they can use concretely to make a difference in their lives in terms of accessing clean water.
Sounds, yes, it's interesting to hear from your law background as well, how you effectively interpret the word right to something, right to water in this case. And that some countries have included that in their constitution. So in a way, it's even more binding, but even more challenging to implement. Tammy, I don't know if you can tell me about the time, if we have one more.
One or two more questions, like 5 minutes, yeah.
Oh, perfect. So then, Rhett, I would like to basically leave the floor for you for some final considerations. I mean, not final considerations, but maybe to kickstart our open discussion. Yeah, I know that in the end you mentioned about a framework of proposals for global water security. So I don't know if you would want to expand a little bit more on that. So basically to wrap up in a couple of points, what is the final message for us to start other open discussions?
Well, first of all, I think it's great. I love having so many other water science policy and management folks here, and especially have somebody who's completed a DPhil in law who's looked at the human right to water, because as much as I'm excited to talk about my own book, I really am thrilled to be able to hear everybody's feedback and opinions and your own research and thoughts. So I'm very excited to get to that part of this as well. But I will say one way that I end the book is I end it talking about there tends to be, in my experience, an impulse in water policy for people to say, well, the most important thing in water policy is we must begin with conservation, and then we will move to storage, and then we will move to augmentation. So the first plan is to teach people how to conserve their water supply, and then to protect it from pollution. Then we'll move to building dams and doing a better job of storing our water. And then as the last resort, we'll think about augmenting water supply with desalination or cloud seeding or something like that. And I think we skip a step when we do that. I actually think that the beginning of good water policy is understanding our water. And I think the most important policy interventions that we can make globally is to invest more in effective monitoring, effective modeling, improving smart grid technology and smart gate technology so that we have better information. And maybe one way to illustrate this is to talk about my work in Lebanon and in Jordan. So I've been, for the last 4 years, working as the principal investigator for a USAID-funded project to improve water supplies in refugee host communities in Lebanon and Jordan. And my work now has gotten to the point we're now serving around 40 communities and a little over 185,000 people in both countries. And the project is now moving into a next phase. And the next phase of the project has given me some hope and some concern about my own framework and opinions. What I thought we would do is what we've been doing is installing small-scale reverse osmosis treatment kiosks on existing wells to improve water supply. Then we've been taking solar panels that are condensing atmospheric water to produce household level drinking water supplies. And we've been doing this in refugee host communities where we've seen conflict between refugees and their host community over sharing water supplies, which is pretty significant, especially in some communities in Tripoli, in Bab el-Tabene and Jabal Nosan in Tripoli, and then a lot of areas in Akkad and northern Lebanon. You see a lot of conflict over water in refugee host communities. We're now moving into a new phase where what we've been talking about is going to some of these communities. Most of them have illegal wells. You'll have expatriate family who will send back money to their village. Their village will take the money, they'll drill a well. They won't tell the government where the well is. They won't do any due diligence about the location of the well, whether it's downstream from a concentrated animal feeding operation or downstream from a septic system. And so they'll drill the well, and then they'll get sick because the well will have elevated pathogens or have elevated nitrates or sulfates, and people will get sick. And so one thing we've done is, well, what if we went into these communities and we made a deal and we said, we will provide you with improved drinking water treatment if in exchange you will disclose the location of your well and allow us to put smart grid technology on it and integrate it with the local water establishment's smart grid so that we can get better information. I thought that this was a really good idea. And I thought that maybe it would be a model for the future about how to address illegal wells in other communities, because in my experience, it's a problem all over the world. Illegal wells exist all over the world, and there's a lot of suspicion from rural communities of the centralized government stepping in and regulating them. And I thought maybe this is a model. And my experience so far in Lebanon is that the amount of distrust of the government is such that they still aren't willing to make that trade for the most part. They aren't willing to trade better drinking water in exchange for trusting the government. Which maybe this is undercutting my my whole thesis of my book, which is that water is more important than anything, but maybe I'll leave us with how can we possibly improve water security globally if we can't combat corruption and if we can't address the issue of public trust in governing institutions. Without that trust, we can't possibly understand our water supply better. And without understanding our water supply better, I just don't see how we can improve water security. So at the risk of undercutting the thesis of my entire book, maybe one of the first steps we need to take the first step of water security is to address corruption and improve trust between communities and their government.
Amazing. Thank you so much. I enjoyed it very much. And Tammy, now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia, and thank you, Rhett, of course, for your reflections and clarifications on the book. So we'd like now to open the floor to all the other participants of the call. So this is a chance to, not just for a classic Q&A, but to offer your own reflections, talk about, for example, you know, what have you experienced in terms of like maybe trust around the issues of water in the societies that you've been in touch with, or what other issues you've had experience on at the intersection between water and society. So I think Sagar is ready to speak. Yeah.
Yeah, are you listening me?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah. Yes. Okay. Hi, Rhett. Thanks for this book. I think it's a very good addition to the existing knowledge that we have in terms of water security, and also you have explained, like Claudia already explained about all these issues. So thank you to the WST team for organizing this webinar. And it's really good to listen to Rhett, and also looking forward to listen to all the views from my fellow colleagues. I would like to directly go deep down into my questions. So Rhett explained about the Israel-Palestine-Jordan issue. So my dissertation in Oxford was also about these issues like Israel, Jordan, and Palestine. So I looked at what would be the model so that all these countries in this region would cooperate so that there will be a peace. Like I developed a model of water energy nexus so that this model would work as a base to create a peace in the region. My question is, as myself, I grew up amid the civil war in Nepal. So it was a decade-long civil war, and I grew up in this civil war condition. So my research in the Jordan, Israel, and Palestine, like I could see a potential that there is a role in the water, like water could play a role, definitely. That was my research. And also I think it's a very good case study to support your view. But my question is regarding the civil war that was happening in Nepal, what do you think the water could play within an internal civil war? That was my question. So I just wanted to know, like, if you have any your insight or view that the water management could play to, I would say, kind of end a civil war, or maybe at least let us say to decrease the effects of the civil war among the citizens. That is one first question. And my next question is, before coming to Nepal, I was working in China. And my work was to look into how can we green the hydropower projects. And I saw in China, like they were developing rapidly, like the AI and robotics and all these things in the hydropower sectors. So basically my role was in the how can we green the hydropowers, and I could see they have used the AI technology to green these water sectors and reduce the impacts of the hydropower. So my question is, in your chapter, I think it was in the last chapter of your book, probably it talks about the water security and technological innovation. So my second question is, what is your view on this? Like, what are the different sectors you have put into your book regarding the technological innovation? So, and also my important questions is, how do you see the future of water security with this development of AI and robotics? These are my two questions. Thank you.
So Sagar, fascinating, and thank you so much for your questions. So with respect to the Civil War, each civil war is as unique as the countries in which they occur. So it's difficult to say how water is going to address civil wars writ large. But here's one sort of attitude that I have about how to improve cooperation in terms of water governance. And that is, if you imagine the world as like a golf ball, it's just a sphere covered in divots. Each divot represents a drainage basin into which all water drains to a common point. If we could go back in time and redraw all jurisdictional boundaries, we would possibly redraw them all to correspond to watersheds and recreate jurisdictional boundaries so that we only had countries based on drainage basins. That's obviously politically infeasible. You can't do that. But much of international and transboundary water law is predicated on the idea of attempting to approximate that, to create some governance institution that governs at the basin level rather than at the national level or at the local level. And I call this, in the book, I call it Goldilocks governance. If we govern too big, then there are too many transaction costs and finding solutions are too difficult. We govern too small, there are too many externalities and governing is too difficult. Governing at the basin level is just right. So one possible way that we can help to mitigate water conflict is to draw the jurisdictional boundaries more appropriately, so that at the very least we're not watching water become a source of conflict, or at least a conflict aggravator or amplifier, which is what water usually is. When it comes to armed conflict, the vast majority of the time, water is a catalyst for cooperation and not conflict. Most of the time, water helps us get together. I think you see that in the Jordan River Basin. Of all the many attempts that we've had to improve cooperation, the Joint Water Committee remains a relative success. At the very least, it's still there, which how many things from the 1994 Peace Treaty and from the Oslo Accords even exist anymore? And the Joint Water Committee still exists. I think it still has major problems, but it hasn't died, which that by itself is some measure of success. Think about 1974, while bullets are still flying between Pakistan and India, they reached the Indus Water Treaty. So water is usually a source of cooperation. I think it's not surprising that our earliest civilizations arose around desert rivers. That is where we all learned how to get along with each other, was along the banks of desert rivers. But this goes back to my argument about better basin level governance. Civil war usually can be mitigated by better water cooperation, but sometimes it gets aggravated. Take my own home region. It was in 1933 that Arizona nearly entered into a civil war against its neighboring state, California, over the Colorado River. California began building the Parker Dam. We had spies in California. When California crossed into Arizona's territory, the spies informed the governor. The governor marched out troops to blow up the dam and kill the Californians. At this exact same time, martial law was declared over the Red River and conflict brewed between Texas and Oklahoma. And there's actually correspondence in Germany amongst generals of the Third Reich saying that the United States would not enter into World War II because they were about to fall into a water-based civil war. So you can see water as both a chance for improved cooperation, as it has been in the Indus and in the Jordan, and as a risk for civil war, as it has been even in my own river basin. Oh, and then your next one is about the tech, the sectors. So the sectors that I largely address in the last chapter are, funnily enough, space exploration, because I'm fascinated by the idea of water in outer space and water space rights, which we can get into that if people are interested. Perhaps not the most pressing water issue, but one of the more interesting ones, at least legally. But I also address a lot of water augmentation issues. So I get into the technology surrounding especially desalination, which I don't know, other people here who are working in water, I don't know if you have the same experience I do, but it just seems like a lot of people who are on the periphery of water conversations, they tend to have this attitude of, well, isn't desalination going to solve all of these problems sometime in the next 5 years? And I always want to be like, no, wait. We need to explain that a little more. So I took some time to talk about that, cloud seeding, bulk water transports, and then I did spend some time talking about improved water conservation technology. So smart pigs and biosynthetic membranes and irrigation. But when it comes to talking about the future of AI, I think that a lot of the future of AI is probably best directed at what I think is one of our most persistent problems in water conservation, which is just non-revenue water, leaks. And so I think as we do a better job of integrating AI with leak detection, I think it's going to really help us with urban water management, because for a lot of communities, I've worked in Amman, Jordan now for quite a while, and I've had a lot of people ask me, what would you do to help water security in Amman? And I said, it's easy, just fix the leaks. If you fix the leaks, you're going to be a lot better off. And so I think that is going to be one of the biggest futures of AI in the water sector, is in leak detection and leak control.
Thank you very much, Rhett, for those answers. I think while I wait for the comments, I like to raise the issue of Flint in Michigan, which I think as we speak now, I believe there's a tentative settlement, which for the value of $600 million US. And so while you were speaking earlier, you made kind of like a reference to the image of like a lawyer going into entering a court with rights, let's say as a tool looking to get something that's changed in the courts of law. So I don't, do you have like a insight into like the background of how that settlement was reached and what sort of like how water played? I mean, water was at the core of the problem. What sort of water policies were used to determine that value?
So I've been involved, or I was involved peripherally on the Flint issues. I've been less involved on the negotiation of settlement, but I was involved in the investigation. What I will say about Flint is not the evidence of the failure of law, it's evidence of the failure of people. So the United States Safe Drinking Water Act is a reasonably strong regulatory tool. And what Flint did in switching its water supply to a closer water supply that had some corrosive effect on older pipes is not that uncommon in the United States. I've represented lots of cities and towns that have made that same decision. What is almost unheard of in my experience is the level of corruption and deceit and deception that occurred in Flint from those that were involved in hiding the presence and evidence of lead contamination. Normally, when you have an exceedance of the lead action level, it's one of the first things that a drinking water system operator knows, and there is immediate ramifications. So when I would represent drinking water systems, if there was an exceedance of the lead action level, I would get a phone call immediately as their outside counsel, and we would report immediately, and we would begin water delivery immediately, and we would immediately begin a sanitary survey of the system. So this goes back to sort of the last point that I made about public corruption, which is it's a major obstacle to water security. And it was corruption within the city that allowed that tragedy to take place. And let's call a spade a spade. It's not just corruption, it's racism. And I think we have to embrace that this was environmental racism. A lot of what drove that corruption was racism. And so I think that is a big part of addressing the issue, is just calling it what it is. How we're going to deal with whether or not implementing this particular proposed settlement is going to be good. A lot of what's driving the settlement has been looking at other settlements similar to asbestos claims, black lung claims, and tobacco claims, which is setting up a trust that will be administered by an independent trustee and settling claims outside of the trust. Whether or not the amount is sufficient and how the trustees are going to allocate it, I don't know. But here's one of my concerns. One of my concerns is that we're talking about chronic learning disabilities for thousands of children. And so quantifying damages there is going to be very, very difficult. On top of that, what I think you have to be concerned about is there are going to be other peripheral issues that I don't know that this settlement is going to cover. For example, what about the spread of Legionella that occurred immediately afterwards? There were lives lost to Legionella spread in Flint. And I think the Legionella spread, and this is me speaking just as an opinion, was related to the elevated lead levels, which is, I think, when they switched to the Flint River, you saw elevated chloride levels. That led them to think that there were elevated disinfectant byproducts, which means the city lowered its disinfectant residual, didn't put as much chlorine into the system, and that allowed Legionella to spread. And so do we take into account some of the peripheral issues that were related to the lead contamination, or is this settlement only there to address people who are suffering from lead poisoning? And I think those are issues that are going to still have to be worked out in the settlement.
Thank you very much. I saw a raised hand by Ida before. Are you?
Yeah, thanks, Tope.
Yeah.
And thank you so much, Rhett, for that very good presentation. I think it's good to hear your views on the different issues you're covering, and it's also been quite interesting reading through what you shared with us. My first comment is to kind of echo your sentiments on non-revenue water and how that's going to be really key in addressing some of our water security issues. So in Kenya, for instance, I think the most recent report we had, we have a non-revenue water rate of 43%. So, that's almost 1 in 2 liters going to waste. So if we could address that, then we're already miles ahead. The question I had is on your interpretation of rights from a law perspective versus a policy advocate perspective. And that was really interesting to hear you describe how you look at it. And it goes back to the JMP ladder question. So it's something that I've really struggled in my work, where we have basic access and we have safely managed access. And from development work, it looks like it's okay to get to basic levels of access. But then from my line of work, where you've traveled around, you do a lot of research, collect a lot of field data, whatever this is we are defining as basic is quite, I think for me, uncomfortable, because it's what you would think as low levels of access if you're comparing it to, say, what people are enjoying in the US and the UK, in the more developed nations. Yet the world is okay with having these definitions and counting people to have this access. So, on the one hand, if you're wearing a law hat, and the other on the policy advocate's hat, I'm curious to hear your views on this issue.
So I suppose I feel much the same way you do, which is I tend to feel uncomfortable with the idea of basic water provision, which is when I enter into a community, and now I've done water development projects on every inhabited continent at this stage, and anytime I walk into a community where we're looking at making some kind of water intervention, my experience is that the people in the community have a much better idea of the water challenges that they're facing and how they need to be addressed. And that very often outside communities or outside donors or development agencies will take a sort of interventionist approach where they don't do enough stakeholder participation and they aren't talking to the people about the challenges that they're facing. With that said, while I have this aspiration that we'll be able to see move beyond basic water supply and development intervention, what I worry about is that by failing to talk to stakeholders, we're failing to have a nuanced approach to improving water supply in individual communities. And this sort of goes back to disinfectant byproducts again, which is, for those of you who don't know what a disinfectant byproduct is, if you have elevated organic contamination in a water supply and you zap it with a disinfectant like chlorine or chlorine dioxide, the byproduct are things like total trihalomethanes or haloacetic acids. They're carcinogens. And in a lot of developed countries, you have the luxury of being able to regulate DBP at the end of the pipe. But in a lot of communities, the thing they're worried about is they're worried about dying of cholera tomorrow. They're not worried about dying of cancer in 50 years. And if you have, whether they're EPA standards or WHO standards or World Bank standards, whatever the standard is that's coming from the funder or from the development agency about what the end of pipe quality has to be, it sometimes dictates the way your treatment intervention. And when it does that in a way that doesn't incorporate the concerns of the local community, it worries me that we're either creating an unsustainable mechanism that's just not going to address the problems that they're really facing. They're not going to be able to get appropriate cost recovery, or we're having something that's going to limit the impact because we can't afford to do a wide-ranging intervention because it's just too expensive to find something that's treating DBPs at the end of the pipe as well. Which I guess I can't help but be a lawyer and have my lawyer hat on. I've learned a lot by running some of these development projects, but at the end, each one of these development projects just leads me more and more to, and this is my own personal bias, more and more to seeing governance and law as where we need to have more interventions. And a lot of the challenges of improving basic water supply are going to come from monitoring. And how do we get better monitoring? We get better monitoring by having better governance. And I think that the more we monitor who's pumping, where they're pumping, and what the water quality is, when there are breakdowns, when there are exceedances, and when we have smart grids that can alert us to exceedances of water quality standards, I think that's really going to be I think that's the future. The better interventions to find ways to reform laws. It's much easier and there's much more enthusiasm for everybody cutting red tape in front of a well or in front of a treatment system. That's what donors want, is that picture of a bunch of people filling up water from a beautiful tap or filling up water out of a treatment system or water coming out of the well. Donors and agencies love those pictures. It's a lot harder to take a picture of you standing in front of an improved regulation at the local agency level. But I think that's actually where a lot of the money would be better spent.
Thank you very much. Of course, so we've been talking a lot about the public sector so far, but I think the private sector is also an important, how do you say, actor or agent in this conversation. So I'd like to invite Rodolfo to offer a brief reflection on that point.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Rhett, for your amazing book. I mean, it's been great to read again some of the views from the law sector. I'm myself, I'm an engineer, so I work normally more on the technical side of things, and recently more also incorporating the economic implications. But it's great to remind us all these many aspects of water. Especially in international community. I wanted just to ask you, given that you've been involved in so many projects with different stakeholders, in my perspective here in Mexico, I've found that working for a private water utility, it's sometimes complicated to convey to the population the actual costs of offering the services and of water and sanitation. And in the case of Mexico in particular, the government has taken the human right and put it in the constitution. It's been, of course, it's something that has to be done, but in reality, we've seen that not only in rural regions, but also in cities, this is just not something feasible economically for most of the utilities. Many times politicians are in charge of public or utilities, and they don't really allow the technicians or the people that operate the systems to provide the services, because of political reasons mostly, tariffs are kept very low, or they allow people just to not pay for water in cases where, I mean, the tariffs are sometimes not even enough to cover the cost, and yet they allow people not to pay or forgive the payment of the services. What are some of the mechanisms that you would propose for tackling this problem?
So, Rodolfo, I mean, you're seeing the same kind of problems we see everywhere. We see the same problem in Arizona. In Arizona, our rate setters for public water companies, the rate setter is the city or the town council. And for private water companies, the rate setter is the corporation commission, all of whom are elected officials. And you don't get reelected by raising people's water rates. And to me, this is sort of, and I'm confident it's the same way in many parts of Mexico, but it's the sleeping dragon of infrastructure right now in many, especially in older urban centers, which is people have no idea how old those pipes are, and they have no idea how soon that lifespan is going to run out. And they don't want to reinvest in making that and in preserving water security. And so they are staring down the barrel of a major water catastrophe in some of these older cities because they're not willing to pay rates that are going to preserve that infrastructure. And so this just gets to the age-old question of how do we honor a human right to water, which should exist? How do we ensure that economically disadvantaged people can afford enough water to live a dignified life? And yet, how do we maintain cost recovery and make sure that we're reinvesting in our water infrastructure and preserving our water quality? I've seen a few things that I think have helped along the way. One interesting thing, so I worked in Ecuador for quite a while, and Ecuador was an interesting situation. So Ecuador implemented a constitutional right to water, and it created all kinds of problems. A lot of the problems that you're seeing now, where they effectively banned privatization and private investment, and so it dried up a lot of potential credit and capital for water development. What was interesting, though, is that they accepted, for better or for worse, hydropower projects. And so what a lot of communities have been doing to get around the limitation on taking private money or private investment or private credit and investing in water is they just call everything hydroelectric, and then that's how they get their hands on private money. Now, maybe that's good for getting your hands on more capital to improve water, but all that means is that we're A, having a somewhat ridiculous loophole, and B, perhaps promoting non-sustainable development of hydroelectric projects, and that's not what we need. What we need is investing in our pipes. But I've seen some other interesting, and Ecuador's really fascinating because Ecuador's 3 largest cities, 2 of them have public water companies, Cuenca and Quito, and Guayaquil has grandfathered in the only remaining private water utility in the country. And it has just faced a lot of discrimination from the central government in terms of its regulation. And so people look at the comparison and they say, well, clearly private water companies have failed because look at Guayaquil. But Guayaquil, first of all, isn't like Cuenca or Quito. It's way at the bottom of the river basin. It's on the coast. It's dealing with all, Cuenca and Quito are way up in the top of the Andes with these beautiful glacier melts. It's a lot cheaper for them to keep clean water than it is for somebody who's at the bottom of the basin. And then the government wants to see the constitutional right to water succeed and wants to see the prohibition against private ownership succeed. And so they favor Cuenca and Quito to the detriment of Guayaquil. But Cuenca's done some interesting things that I think might be adaptable to the private context, which is I've seen Cuenca be successful where other utilities haven't, and I think there might be 3 explanations for this. Number one is they just have more control over the raw water resource. And that's not true in a lot of areas where the utility itself may have very little control over the actual raw water. And so I think putting more control of the water utility and managing the raw water resource as a water resource rather than as a national park or rather than a recreational facility or a hydroelectric facility. So many raw water upstream resources are managed like national parks or recreation areas or hydroelectric reservoirs, and they're not managed like what they really are, which is this is our water supply. The other is that there's more diversification in Cuenca's portfolio, meaning they actually own the telecommunications utility as well, which allows some cross-subsidization so by being able to diversify a little bit, I think it's improved their business model. And the other is just a lot of investment on water consciousness within the community, I think has gone a long way. And, you know, those are investments that don't pay off for a generation, but when they pay off, I think it really makes a difference by educating the public. And the president of Cuenca System, I think, just said something that I know you'll relate to, which is people will complain about water rates and they'll say, well, God gives us water for free. And one of my favorite things is God does give us water for free, but God doesn't give us engineers and pipes for free. Which I think is a good way of thinking about how to educate the people that in the end, yes, water is a gift from God, but we got to pay everybody to lay the pipe and manage it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rhett, for that. I believe Nsuku has a question.
Yes, I do. Thank you so much, Rhett. It's been a very interesting discussion. Every topic has just been very interesting, from the transboundary discussion we had earlier, and now we're coming into the private sector. And in the same vein with the private sector, I'm just curious about the role of organizations that aren't necessarily involved in public water supply. So your mines, your manufacturing companies, which are more, you know, water intensive in their processes. What's their role in the grander scheme of things? And what's also the role of global reporting or public reporting of water data, and how can we better leverage that kind of data to either improve water supply at grassroots level, or maybe hold them more accountable to working more on the demand side of just reducing their water use and so forth. And then my last question is just when and how can one get the book in South Africa?
Well, to answer your last question first, Nsuku, first of all, I'm fascinated by your research because I've done a lot of work on mine remediation and mine land reclamation. So hopefully this is the beginning of a chance for you and I to talk and learn. If you will send me, just shoot me an email and I will get you a book. I'm happy to do that. Anybody who wants a book, I will find a way to get you a book. Just let me know. So talking about organizations that, you know, that aren't like, you know, water utilities, other private sectors, what is their role? So mines, I mean, you've seen mines take some role in improving water security in some of their communities. So a lot of my experiences, especially with mining in Peru and in Chile, where you've seen mining companies invest in improved water security from the communities where they're deriving a lot of their employees from. They'll invest in improved water infrastructure. But a lot of that is frankly incidental. It's incidental to the development of desalination for water they were going to use in their processes anyway. So this is especially true in the Atacama, which is in northern Chile. It's really, really arid region, the most arid region in the world. So while it looks great that they build really nice desalination plants, in the end, it's really more about their copper mining facilities than it is about improving water supplies for the community, although there's certainly the benefit of having healthier, happier workers. But I do think mining communities do have a role to play. And I think a lot of the role to play is talking about creating proper incentives for abandoned mine remediation. So it's not that difficult, hopefully, to create the right incentives for existing mining operations to remediate contamination. Hopefully we have good mine reclamation laws. Hopefully we have good discharge protection laws. But the real challenge is, what do we do with abandoned mines? There are abandoned mines all over the world that are a major source of water contamination, but nobody's really responsible for them. So one thing that I think that we can do is create the right incentives to encourage the mining community to get more involved in the remediation of abandoned mines. And I think that we can do this by doing a few things. One, I think, is we want to capture their expertise in mine remediation, and we want their resources for approving mines. They already have to remediate their own mines. We might as well find a way to help them remediate the abandoned mines. So I think one thing that we can do is create Good Samaritan permits, which are to say we will permit your remediation, and as long as you are remediating this mine, you'll be shielded from discharge liability associated with the mine. A lot of mining companies don't want to remediate abandoned mines because they're afraid that they'll get their fingerprints on liability that they're going to answer for later in court. The other thing that we might want to do is have an expedited permitting process or a cheaper permitting process for mines that have a net ecological benefit. So if the mine can come in and say, yes, we're mining, yes, we're digging a big hole, yes, we're polluting the earth, but we are remediating the following 7 abandoned mines in the river basin so that we can show a net improvement of the water quality. In that case, I think we might be able to find a way to create an expedited permitting process for those mining facilities and create the right incentives for them to invest in mine remediation. And then one other thing that's at least worth thinking about, although I have my concerns about it, is creating a water quality trading market for remediation, which is we create, what's the assimilative capacity of the receiving water body? We create a buffer of safety below that assimilative capacity. And we tell mining companies, listen, if you can get the water improved this much, then any other mining community in the region can come and buy water treatment credits from you that will allow them to discharge. I know that what that basically means is you're permitting mines to discharge pollution into a river, but if the net effect of the policy is improving the water quality, then it's something akin to carbon trading credits with respect to climate change. Now, I should pause and say it has all of the same downsides of that approach too. So, it's not like we should all run out and implement that policy right now. We should think long and hard about it. But I'll tell you another area that this is a project I've been working on recently that's been really, really exciting, has been getting breweries involved in water policy, which has been really fun and interesting. What we've been doing in communities we have some communities that have really water intensive crops, and their growing season is during the low flow season on the river. And we've gone to these communities, we said, well, listen, if you will shift from growing corn or cotton, and you'll shift to growing barley and hops, it will save us an enormous amount of water because you will be taking water out during the high flow season in the spring instead of during the low flow season in the summer, and it'll save everybody a lot of water. And the response from these communities is, listen, it's too cheap to sell barley and hops as an animal feed, and we're not going to make enough money because we're selling corn and cotton at premium prices. The only way we can make enough money is by selling barley and hops to breweries to make beer. And so what we've done is we've worked around the world to bring microbreweries and malting facilities into farming communities to make it cheaper for them to shift from cotton to growing barley and hops, which is saving an enormous amount of money, and it's allowing them to get more money for their crops. So I think being creative about finding ways to bring in the private sector and water conservation projects is just really, really important. And then you asked about global reporting and what can we do. And I think when it comes to improving incentives for reporting mechanisms, a lot of that is about building the right system and creating the right automatic monitoring systems. But let me suggest something that might be a little radical, but it might help us, which is, I don't know if you've had the same experience, but to me, the real challenge for monitoring and reporting has been in rural communities. Rural communities have tended to, it's not that hard to find a way to monitor most urban water uses. But the real challenge is in agricultural communities, rural communities, because they see reporting requirements as the first step to management. And they see management as a step towards stealing their water to give it to thirsty cities. Every country I've ever worked in has really suspicious farmers who think the cities are coming for their water. And one way that we might be able to encourage voluntary reporting is by creating a property mechanism that allows landowners and farmers to record a property restriction on their land, on their deed, and record it with the government that says, as long as I am reporting on my water consumption, I get a cut on my property taxes. And that might create the right incentive for rural communities to report without seeing it as quite the same risk of a sort of top-down city stepping in and mandating reporting, rather than I am choosing to report in exchange for a tax break.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions from Rita, and then we've got one last question after that before closing. So Kavita, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much for the session. It's a long time just talking, I have two questions, but before that, I want to thank you for the book. And I was just thinking that in WSPM, we have this thing called reading circles. I don't know if it was there during your time. Okay, so I was just thinking that like the chapter that you shared with us and the introduction, it looked like it touched upon a lot of topics that we do read in the course, and maybe this could be one of the books in the reading circles list, and people would get a good idea of the topics that we're going to engage with in the year. That is one thing that I wanted to say. The other thing is that there is one chapter which is on climate change. I haven't been able to read it, but I'm looking forward to. And because I want to work in the Himalayan region, and I've always worked in that region, and climate change is such a burning topic for that area, because all the glaciers are in the Himalayas, and glaciers are a source of water for a large part of our country. So I just wanted to know, like, your topic is just add water, and how have you, I'm just curious to know as to how have you used that concept in relation to climate change? That was one. And then the second question is disconnected, but I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in this talk about water governance and law, that how you look at problems of water security being solved is primarily using water governance and law to solve these issues. So have you noticed that the fact that these approaches are primarily top-down, in some way the communities that are at the receiving end and for whom the work is being done, they might feel disconnected from the entire issue of water security, and having communities feel that they are as much a part of the problem and the solution is important, and that is missed in a lot of times when we look at water governance and law and how it is approached, like in the top-down manner. So have you thought about this question of like also putting communities at the center of this approach, and how could that happen? Because currently that doesn't, especially in my country. So sorry, those are the two questions.
So fantastic. So first of all, I would love it if my book were being read with the reading circles at WSPM. That would just that'd tickle me to death that people are reading it. I just love that anybody ever reads it. Makes me feel really good. I'll be honest with you. I'm really excited about having read a book, but to be totally honest with everyone right now, a lot of being a water law professor and water lawyer is just something that neither my parents nor my children really understand at all what in the world that means. But they do understand being an author and writing a book. And so what's been really great is it's one of the few times in my career where my parents and my children are all like, wow, this is fantastic. Look at you, you wrote a book. So that's been one of my favorite things about it, is that my mom and my dad and my kids get excited for me. So anybody reading it is just a cherry on top of the sundae. So on climate change, you know, I think I probably have what I fear is a controversial position, and I'm probably overstating it for shock value, but that's all right. I'm going to say it anyway. I actually don't think we should talk about climate change anymore. I think we should stop saying it. And it's not because climate change isn't real, it is. And it's not because the science behind climate change is wrong, it's not. The reason is that I think as a policy paradigm, it hasn't gotten us far enough. And I think we need to, if you are happy with how the climate change discussion is going, then you're fine. But if you're like me and you don't think it's doing enough, then it's time for us to think about whether or not we need a better way to talk about it. And I think the better way to talk about it is water. Because first of all, when you talk about climate change, there's just too many people in the world who say, well, you should worry about climate change. And they say, oh, I love it when the climate changes, leaves changing colors and flowers are blooming. And you're like, no, 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 no. I mean, global warming. I would love a warmer globe. It's too cold anyway. No, 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 no. I mean, like sea level's going to rise. Great, I'll live closer to the beach. No, 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 no. I mean, like it's going to get, 2 to 5 degrees warmer. It's going to get that much warmer today. What's the big deal? What people really care about when you talk to them about climate change is they care about drought, flood, plagues, and wars. And that's what we mean when we talk about water security. And so if it were up to me, I would reframe the entire climate change debate to talking about water. And I would make the entire thing about water, because water is the cutting edge of climate change. That's where it's going to matter to most people. They don't know how much carbon is in the air. They don't know how many degrees warmer it is. They've never seen a glacier or a polar bear. But what they do know is there's a drought or there's a famine. And I just think we're better off speaking about our problems in that way. On top of that, we talk about climate change as if it's our only sustainability problem. It's not. If I could take a magic wand and wave it and make climate change disappear, it wouldn't solve all of our sustainability problems. We'd still have major problems associated with population growth and economic development and consumption patterns, and we'd still have to solve those. And if we talk about our sustainability problems in terms of water, which expresses itself in both food and energy, then I really feel like we're getting more to the heart of the real problem. Now, I think there's lots of people who disagree with me and are probably right. But I think in talking about the Himalayas especially, one thing I'm really interested in the future, and I'd love to talk to you more about it when you have a moment, is the regulation of transboundary glaciers, or glaciers with transboundary implications. It was research that I started working on when I was in the Andes, but I just think that we are barely at the beginning of understanding how to create a legal regime that governs glaciers, because these are really the water towers for billions of people, but they are often only located within one sovereign state. And so the legal mechanisms are different than for a fugitive resource like liquid water. And so I feel like the future of water law is atmospheric water vapor and glaciers, because we just have no legal regime to govern those things. We've learned to have legal regimes that govern groundwater. We've learned to have legal regimes that govern rivers and lakes, but we haven't learned how to develop something for glaciers and atmospheric water. And with climate change, glaciers and atmospheric water are going to become a more important part of how we manage water, getting water out of the air and taking care of it when it's frozen on a mountaintop. And then on the top-down community issue, in my experience, most of the time, these legal interventions, they tend to be top-down, which I think is unfortunate, in part because the more top-down legal interventions are, the slower they are and the more political they are. And I'll say this, this is just an observation. For my entire career, I have looked at water as if it was unique politically. Water, as you know, is hyper-political. It's a very political issue, but it doesn't break down in a normal political discussion. It's not like it's a discussion about progressives and conservatives. Water usually is a conversation between urban people and rural people, is usually how the politics breaks down. And the conversation about water politics has tended to sound something like this. It has tended to sound like urbanites saying, you rural people, you miners and farmers are the ones that are using all of the water. You're the ones that are polluting all of the water. You don't have our education system. You live far apart, so you're not as sustainable because you don't live close together. You have long commutes and long pipelines, and you drill for oil, and so you people are the problem. And the rural communities are saying, no, you urbanites look down on us. You think that we're backwards and we're poor and we're stupid. We're the ones that are growing your food. We're the ones that are making your energy. And if you listen, it seems like the politics, global politics, and certainly national politics in my country, in the United States, they are sounding less and less like a conversation between conservatives and progressives, and more like water politics, which I think is an interesting thing to keep our eyes on, that the whole world seems to be talking broadly politically in the way that water politics has always been discussed. I think one of the possible ways of driving this down to the more local level is to think about water markets and to provide some leverage at the community level for them to own and control and negotiate their own water rights. But I always caution this, as someone who represents Native American tribes in water rights disputes, they have very secure legal water rights, but there's a very big difference between a legal right to water and wet water flowing through your canal or pipeline. And I think you've definitely seen this in Australia. You know, Australia, especially in the Murray-Darling Basin, has moved to a really strong market-based water allocation. It was seen as a model around the world. But I think you've seen in recent years the shift from the releases moving from the agricultural ministry to the energy ministry. These kind of top-down shifts, they have ramifications even in what looks like a localized water management system, which is we're giving these communities their own private water rights so that they have leverage and power. But in the end, the person making the decision about when to open the gate on the dam is someone in Canberra, not someone in Perth.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rhett. I think that's all we have the time for today. So it's been very interesting to listen to all those implications of because water really is everywhere, and it feels like we all, every single human being on earth probably has like a feeling of like, oh, you know, they know that they need water and they expect it to be available, but of course that availability can be very complicated in contested regions. So I will just give you maybe a couple minutes for a closing remark or greetings, and I will. I'm sure that, so just in case people didn't know, you are now in Oxford for the next maybe couple months, perhaps, and we'll try maybe to organize meetings with the incoming cohorts or the outgoing cohorts. With and as the COVID situation allows us to meet. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. A couple people had to leave in the last couple minutes, but this will be recorded and the recording will be made available to all of you. And you can go ahead with your closing remarks, words.
Thank you again so much to everyone for your participation. I hope that this is the beginning of friendship and collaboration with all of you. So please, if I can ever be of any assistance in your research or in your work, please consider me at your service. If anything has come across during our conversation, it is my almost manic obsession and love of all things related to water. So if you don't ever think that, oh, I don't want to bother him, you will not bother me. I will be absolutely thrilled to death to talk to you. So please contact me if I can ever be of any help. I am in Oxford right now with my family. So if there is an opportunity for me to meet as COVID conditions allowing, I would love to be of any help to anyone, not just while we're in Oxford, but anytime. And to Elizabeth and to Manisha and to Jehun, it just warms my heart just to see you all and to have you here. I have just the best memories, and it changed my life to be your friend and to be involved in the Weidenfeld. I can't believe I was lucky enough to do that. But I guess what I will end off with is what I end the book with, which is one of my very favorite actors and action stars is Bruce Lee. I just love Bruce Lee. He's amazing. And he had, his theory of martial arts was to be water, that if you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. If you put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. Water flows and it crashes. Be water, my friends. I don't think that we can manage water unless we can be water, unless we have an appreciation that it both flows and crashes, appreciate its constructive and destructive capacity. And if we're not adaptable, if we don't change like water changes, we have to have adaptive capacity in our legal systems, in our infrastructure. We have to learn to change as our water supply changes, and it is changing. That is the nature of climate change, is that our water supply is changing. But I'll leave you with one last thought, which is the most important way we can be like water. I started this talking about growing up in Arizona, and I'll end it that way, which is when I was a little boy, I would go to Sunday school and we would sing a song called Give Said the Little Stream. And the song was, give said the little stream, give, oh give, give, oh give said the little stream as it hurried down the hill. I'm small, I know, but wherever I go, the grass grows greener still. And the best way we can be like water is to be generous. So as you look around at so many people who are suffering both under the current pandemic conditions and suffering because of water insecurity around the world, the greatest way we can all be like water is to be generous, to give of your time, give of your resources, give of your friendship, just give. It's the best way to be like water. So be water, my friends.